Nikki Budzinski. I'm very excited to be here. I'm the advisor to Climate Jobs National Resource Center. I'm here to help facilitate and moderate this exciting panel discussion and breakout room where we'll be talking about the Carbon-Free and Healthy Schools Initiative, one of the most exciting initiatives I think the Climate Jobs National Resource Center is working on, both at the national level, but working to partner with our state and local coalitions to help build these initiatives all across the country. Because the Carbon-Free and Healthy Schools Initiative really kind of is a merging of three of the bigger priorities for Climate Jobs National Resource Center. One, it's creating healthier classrooms for students to learn, making it a more conducive environment to reaching their greatest potential, both in the classroom, and then you're going to hear from some of our panelists talk about things we can be also doing immediately outside of our schools to reduce carbon emissions and make for healthier schools and classrooms. Second, this initiative is a great way to mobilize both community, students, and teachers. You're going to hear from a leader in the Sunrise Movement on our panel, Anil, who's become incredibly active in helping to launch these initiatives in New York City. And I find his work incredibly inspiring. It should be for other students across the country to get involved in addressing our climate crisis. And then third, and obviously equally importantly, that you've been hearing about throughout this summit is the creation of good paying union jobs. Through this initiative, Carbon-Free and Healthy Schools, we're creating good union jobs through this initiative in all of the states that you're going to be hearing about. I'm going to be introducing our panelists before we get started, just to give everybody a quick run through of how we're going to be, how I'll be facilitating this breakout discussion. Is I have some pre-prepared questions that I'm going to be asking our panelists. We're really honored to have panelists today in this breakout discussion from Illinois, from California, from New York. But I also want to mention that Climate Jobs National Resource Center is also busy creating this same initiative in other states as well, including Rhode Island, Connecticut, Wisconsin, and Texas. And so this is really a growing movement that we're very excited about. So I'm going to do a quick introduction to our panelists. I have some pre-prepared questions that we're going to go through. We find they'll be informative for all of you that have tuned in. And then we're going to give you an opportunity to ask us questions. My colleague, Dan Sherrill, who is the Director for State to Federal Campaigns for Climate Jobs National Resource Center, at the end will be facilitating your questions to our panelists on this topic. So we look forward to a good discussion. And so I'd like to dive right in and introduce some of our panelists. First, I'd like to introduce Justin Thompson. Justin is a senior policy analyst for the National Education Association. We're really excited to have him here. His primary focus within the National Education Association is specifically on climate and environmental justice. So we'll look forward to hearing his thoughts on this initiative. Second, we're very excited to have Seanelle Leesang, who is a UFT member and also a science teacher at Intermediate School 68 in Brooklyn. I think she's actually at her school today participating in our panel discussion, so we're really excited to have Seanelle be a part of this. And then I'd also like to introduce Anil Singh. Anil is just a graduate recently from Townsend Harris High School in Queens. He's a member of the Sunrise Movement, which if you don't know, and you should know, which is a movement of young people that's focused on addressing climate change, but also creating good jobs, which is really the intersection of what we're talking about today on our panel. So we're excited to have Anil join us. We also have joining us is Joseph Bryant. He's the president of SEIU Local 1021. SEIU Local 1021 represents 60,000 employees in local governments and nonprofits and healthcare programs and schools in Northern California. So we're really excited to have President Bryant joining us for this discussion as well. I'd also like to introduce John Paul, JP, I should say, JP, excuse me, who is joining us.
John Paul is my name.
Thank you. Who is with TWU Local 100. JP is actually a vice president for TA Surface Division, which are members that are represented in the operate and maintain the bus fleets in New York City. So we're really excited to hear JP's perspective. And then my friend from Illinois, Gina Walsh, we're really excited to have Gina. Gina is the Deputy Director for the Heat and Frost Insulators and Signatory Contractors Labor Management Cooperative Trust. I'd also like to note that Gina was the minority State Senate leader from 2017 to 2020 and just recently left the state Senate in Missouri, and has been a fighter for working people in Missouri. And I've been excited to work with her on our Climate Jobs Illinois initiative. So very exciting to have Gina joining us as well today. So we're going to kick this off and just dive right into this initiative. And I have a series of questions for our panelists. And I'd like to start with Justin. So Justin, my question is, why is it important for educators to ensure our schools are carbon-free and healthy, not just from a perspective of energy savings, which we know is important, but in terms of the health and safety and actually taking climate action? Why do you see this to be an important initiative?
Thank you so much, Nikki, for the introduction and for the question. And thank you to the Climate Jobs National Resource Center for having me here today. And so I kind of took this question and kind of looked at it in a couple of different ways. So the first thing that I looked at was, how does carbon-free schools enhance health for our students and our educators? Because throughout the COVID pandemic, the health and safety of our educators and students has been our number one priority. And so the move toward carbon-free schools is a really important step in enhancing the health of our educators, our students, and our schools at large. But we also have to look at carbon emissions and school health from kind of multiple perspectives. So on one hand, we have to be conscientious of schools and institutes of higher ed as emissions generators. So whether that's from our buildings and equipment, from education-related travel, from the life cycle of goods and services used, the disposition of waste, or even sometimes where schools and institutes of higher ed are located. And schools, colleges, and universities can all take steps to mitigate these carbon emissions, but they can also play a role in educating students, staff, and the community about these important issues. And so one of the things that we've seen at the NEA that I think is really interesting is how environmental concerns can successfully be woven into collective bargaining demands. In fact, the Bargaining for the Common Good Network has material on how you can potentially incorporate climate justice demands into union contract campaigns. And I would be happy to get that material out to folks that are interested in whatever way we can. But even beyond that, as we incorporate these perspectives into ongoing work at the local level, we also have to remember these are intimately linked to both equity and student learning outcomes. Environmental equity and student learning outcomes are very closely aligned. Poor local climate conditions lead to worse student learning outcomes, whether that's related to pollutants, hotter and more humid conditions that require greater emissions to control, or disrupted learning due to climate-related disasters such as hurricanes, floods, and fires that we've seen especially more recently in the past couple of years. So as the carbon-free and healthy school campaigns continue, it's important for us to help advance equity and prioritize the communities most impacted by these inequities. And so that was kind of part one of how I took that question. And then part two is, what are the other ways that carbon-free schools can benefit our educators and our students? And I look at this through a lens of student learning and engagement. So as we see more schools transition to carbon-free and more sustainable practices, they're inherently creating hands-on learning opportunities for students. And involving and engaging these students in sustainable practices can help students understand how they can be involved and work toward climate action. Educators have the opportunity to use these practices to teach students about clean energy, about decarbonization, composting, electric vehicles, solar panels, and so much more. And this can help enable our students to have the agency to work toward larger societal efforts around climate change. Because there are so many students out there that want to take action on climate change because Gen Z knows that this is the most important issue in their life. And some of them will even consider pursuing a field or a career in the field. But many of them just haven't had the opportunity to learn the basics about climate change throughout their K-12 education. There was actually a survey back in 2019 that showed that 86% of educators believed the issues around climate change should be taught in schools, but more than half of those same educators said they don't talk to it about their students themselves. When I was teaching in Dallas, Texas, teaching pre-calculus, I wanted to find ways to incorporate it into my lesson planning, but I didn't know how. And of those educators that said they don't talk about it, more than 80% of them said that either they don't talk about it because it's not related to their subject area, or they didn't have the materials or preparation to teach about it. So having schools in conjunction with communities working toward carbon-free schools can help give educators that hands-on outlet to work with their students for healthier schools, healthier communities, and a more stable future for today's students.
Thank you, Justin. That was very helpful. And actually, I think it's like a perfect segue to Seanelle, who's actually in a classroom, is an intermediate school science teacher, and, could speak, specifically to kind of exactly the curriculum points that you were making, Justin, and how we're modifying curriculum to adjust and address the climate crisis. So Seanelle, I would ask you, your question is, what opportunities do you think this carbon-free and healthy schools campaign raises for more deeply incorporating climate and sustainability education into school curricula and setting up students for potential careers in the clean energy sector?
Good afternoon, everyone, and thank you, Nikki, for that introduction. With regard to the question you posed, carbon-free healthy schools, the campaign aims to make school buildings safe for students and staff members and create models for carbon-free buildings overall in an effort to combat climate change, as well as create jobs within our communities. So then our schools will become models for green infrastructure. So with that said, it will undoubtedly innovate teaching and learning in our schools, in our educational system as a whole. Changing the infrastructure for our schools will provide opportunities to change our current curriculum, to incorporate more meaningful sustainability education, as well as job training for our students who will make up our future workforce, as well as have a direct impact on our environment. Schools will be able to make learning more applicable to the real world while making a positive impact on the environment by reducing carbon emissions. As I said before, schools play a vital role in educating the workforce of tomorrow. Therefore, we need to make sure that we are adequately preparing, training our students to one day occupy those jobs. And that means changing the way we teach in our classrooms, changing the way we focus on the environment or science education within our schools. Schools are also responsible for closing the achievement gap and providing equitable opportunities for our students. And we can do so with the creation of clean energy jobs and sustainability education. When schools are equipped with energy efficient heating and cooling systems, solar panels, and so forth, they're able to serve as a model for our students and our community at large. It promotes enrollment in STEM careers, STEM opportunities within schools. Students can actually learn about how solar panels operate through real world application, as well as many other examples with the changes that will come with the incorporation of clean energy equipment in our schools.
Thank you, Seanelle. That was great. And I also want to just give you some credit in UFT, the New York City CLC, and I think SEIU, BJ, I think just in April, you guys launched your campaign in New York City on this carbon-free schools initiative. So I just want to say a special shout out to you for that. And I appreciated your comments and kind of the challenges of how we're adapting the classroom to incorporate this really special campaign. I also wanted to mention to everybody, I incorrectly mentioned the slide. I gave you a wrong Slido number. So let me tell you the correct Slido number for down the road. We're going to get to Q&A, and you're going to want to enter this Slido number in to ask us questions, ask our panel questions. That number is 464766. Again, the correct Slido number is 464766. So great, we're going to keep moving on. And I'm going to go to Seanelle. Seanelle, I have a question for you. We spoke with educators and talked about curriculum. You just recently graduated from high school and you're a climate activist with the Sunrise Movement. So my question for you is, how is the climate crisis impacting students in New York, where I know you've been very active and on the front lines, in particular in Title I schools? Can you share your thoughts on that?
Yeah, sure. First, thank you, Nikki, and thank you all for having me here. Today, I'm really glad to have the opportunity to speak about this issue. I just want to start, before I answer your question, by acknowledging kind of the framing of it, which I think is really important. How is climate change affecting students right now, right? As opposed to how will it affect us years from now? And I think that's really important because, and it's kind of been how, at least I've noticed the discussion change from in recent years, especially from the future effects of climate change to, as we now recognize them, the current effects and the fact that it's happening right now. And we obviously see that all the time, obviously recently with hurricanes such as Ida. We see it with wildfires, flooding, heat waves, and all those things impact, the entire country, especially students, including students as well. And then another impact of burning fossil fuels is obviously air pollution. Air pollution, there was a study done, published in the Lancet Medical Journal a while back, and it found that air pollution globally causes 9 million premature deaths, which is 16% of all premature deaths worldwide. It's the number one cause. It costs about $4.2 trillion, or 6.2% of global GDP. So it's a big problem, to say the least. And that problem extends into our classrooms. Even before students get into classrooms, obviously air pollution in their neighborhoods can cause asthma, which is, of course, a huge issue for students. And like with every issue, these issues are intersectional. So air pollution is obviously a huge problem, especially in poorer neighborhoods, especially in places like in New York, for example, like in the Bronx, where it's purposely surrounded by all of these expressways, creating all of this pollution that kids have to breathe in and then bring that to school. There's also problems in the school buildings themselves. One major one is lack of air conditioning. I believe the most recent statistics is about 20% of New York City classrooms without air conditioning. I was lucky because the schools I went to were made around 2000, so they're relatively new, and they did have central air, but a lot of schools in New York City are almost 100 years old, especially, again, like schools that are in poorer neighborhoods, what they call zone schools, which are like the neighborhood schools. Those are especially often older, and they're often relying on window units, or sometimes classrooms don't have them. And obviously that has been, the need for effective circulation has been exacerbated by the pandemic. And it makes it harder to concentrate, to learn. Like Justin said earlier, it's harder for students to concentrate when they're, when there's no air conditioning, especially as temperatures continue to rise from climate change. And also that inefficient energy spending has an effect on the budget for education. It's about $70 million per year in New York City. And that's just, in one city in the country. That money could be spent on education, and it could be spent especially on education for students who need that extra funding in schools that are overcrowded and underfunded. So that's really taking away from students' education. And then, so those are kind of, I think, some of the main ones. And then more broadly, I would say in terms of climate change in general, obviously we've seen a lot of student activism. I myself started with the climate strike it's going to be about 2 years ago, actually, I think yesterday. And there's another climate strike this Friday. So about 2 years, but we've seen a lot of student activism, and obviously that's something that should be celebrated. But the flip side of that is that students have this burden put on them by the climate crisis, that we feel like we're responsible for doing something because our leaders haven't really stepped up. And while it's, it's admirable that like a lot of students have heeded that goal, it's also kind of an unfair burden that our society's placed on students. And we ought to use that and recognize that and really say, okay, let's like solve this problem and not just rely on students. Obviously student activism is important, but let's like actually solve this problem so students can actually go back to like being students and being kids. As much as I'm like glad to be here today, I love like doing activism. I'd rather like do other things. So yeah, I think that's another way that the climate crisis affects students, and obviously that also impacts education. But yeah, so in all, the climate crisis is happening now, and we need carbon-free and healthy schools in order to help students with their educations.
Thanks, Anil. Yeah, I couldn't agree with you more. I think it's a shared responsibility that we all should carry as it relates to addressing the climate crisis and what these future industries are going to look like and what the types of jobs they are that we're building for in the future. So that I agree with you. That is a shared responsibility. So next, I'm actually going to go to President Joseph Bryant from SEIU Local 1021. It actually is a little bit of a, Justin touched on this in the beginning of our panel discussion around how you can kind of integrate or use collective bargaining agreements and negotiations as a way to also further addressing the climate crisis. So President Bryant, my question would be, I know SEIU Local 1021 is exploring these opportunities, how to incorporate carbon-free and healthy schools into collective bargaining demands and negotiations with school districts. Can you tell us more about this strategy and the opportunity it raises for us to make sure that climate action is squarely on the bargaining table?
Thank you, Nikki, and it is a pleasure to be here. And good afternoon and good morning to all the siblings, brothers and sisters who are with us today. And just before I jump into the specifics of answering the question, Nikki, I wanted to give a little bit of context about just myself in terms of why climate justice is meaningful. I grew up in an area called Richmond, California. It's about 20 miles from San Francisco. It's home to the Richmond, or one of the Richmond Chevron refineries, and it is one of the biggest polluting entities here in the Bay Area, and specifically in Richmond, a place that's 80% people of color. You have twice the asthma rate that you have in neighboring cities and counties. You have higher heart disease rates. You have higher cancer rates. So when we talk about environmental justice, when we talk about climate justice, I've certainly seen friends and family members be impacted directly in regards to the impacts that take place with the environment. So just in regards to the approach with common good bargaining, and as it specifically pertains to climate justice, one, normally, when we as labor unions go into negotiations with our employers, we bargain around our bread and butter issues, right? We bargain around wages, we bargain around benefits, we bargain around working conditions. And one of the things that we've come to realize is if we solely focus on just those key areas, which we know we have to do, we're not necessarily maximizing the full potential impact that we can have for our members. A couple of the areas when we just focus on those topics that we miss is one, particularly being a primarily public sector local, it doesn't necessarily fully engage the public like we need to engage them. So if we just focus on, what is our wage increases, what benefits, it doesn't necessarily build the audience that we need to have the leverage to be able to have success at the bargaining table. And another area where I think it falls a bit short is even if during our 9 to 5 or 8 to 4, or 8 to 2, whatever the case may be, we are decent conditions. Again, if we go back to our communities, and in our communities, we're suffering from, again, higher asthma rates due to, pollutants from different corporations, again, like Chevron, or also from our schools. Our schools are actually a high carbon emitting entity when you look at it collectively throughout the country. So as we approach the bargaining tables, we really approach with the mindset of, yes, we want to win the core bread and butter issues, but if our members are going home and going to unsafe working conditions, we feel like that is just as important and is something that needs to be prioritized and could be brought to the table. In much of our contracting language, it includes clauses like other conditions. And we've made the argument that other conditions include lowering carbon emissions specifically from the entities that we are negotiating with, whether it be a city, whether it be a county, whether it be, in this case, again, the carbon-free and healthy schools initiative. These are all angles that we're pushing, and to the chagrin of our employers at times, because it makes them do work. One of the things that we, in order to have leverage in pushing, is we need information. And we have a list of items which we send to many of our employers for requests of information, talking about their infrastructure, talking about what equipment that they have, talking about what emissions that they're putting out. And it is a push and pull with the employers because, again, they want to keep the conversation a bit more narrow, a bit more focused on, again, those bread and butter items. But again, we make the case that health and safety in our communities is a part of our contracts. So that is one way that we've made sure to push and have that as a part of the table when we are having any negotiations with our employers. And our strategy has been really three-pronged. One, we have the legal approach, which again is to say that we are making the case that the matters of carbon emissions are matters subject to mandatory bargaining. So we go back and forth from a legal perspective, but we feel that we have a very strong case in regards to pursuant of that. Two, politically, we are going to different elected leaders. So specifically for the carbon-free Healthy Schools Initiative, we're going to the Board of Educators, we're going to Board of Supervisors, we're going to different councils, we're going to different mayors to say the impacts that you're having as a carbon emitter are having impacts on our members, whether it be neatly captured in the contract or not. And three, which is the part that really moves things, is the activism work that we have to do. And again, in creating a larger space where we're saying that, yes, we deserve to be compensated fairly to be able to do our job. We want our workers to be safe while they're doing the job, and we want the community to be safe while we do our work. And that engages the community, allows us to have a bigger conversation with the community, and it allows us to create movement around the fight against or for climate justice, to say this is bigger than us and we are all part of it. So those are some of the ways that we've taken the approach, but we have prioritized it. We have proposals at least 6 schools currently for carbon emission reduction, and also common sense things like replacing of old equipment for newer non-carbon emitting equipment where applicable, and retrofitting in ways to where the school is going to lower its carbon footprint. So those are just some of the ways and strategies, but it must be a part of the way we approach. We can't think narrowly in 2021. We have to think about our memberships and the communities that our members live in. And this is one of the vehicles and tools that we use to be able to get that across.
Thank you. That is really inspiring, the holistic approach to this campaign. And I think that's just really great and very inspiring. So thank you, President Bryant, for sharing that. I'm going to go now to JP. There's also been a lot of discussion around electrification of electrifying our bus fleets. And obviously school buses are one source of emissions. And so electrifying our bus fleet is something that I know a lot of carbon-free school initiatives are thinking about adopting as one component in addition to energy efficiencies and other work within the building. So JP, can I ask you, TWU represents about 3,500 school bus drivers.
Yes.
Along with mechanics for New York City municipal buses. Can you talk to us a little bit more about the process of bus electrification? What has been TWU's role and engagement around bus electrification? And then the challenges and opportunities it poses to the workers that you represent.
All right. So New York City Transit, which is a public transit, is not your traditional school bus system. We move tens of thousands of students every day. We don't do it in the yellow bus. We do have a whole division dedicated to school buses, which is a little bit further north of where I'm at. So I'm going to try to incorporate the two if I can, because some of your panelists may know, and some of the people in the audience may know, they're trying to transition New York City Transit from a diesel natural gas fleet to an electric fleet. So there's a similar dynamic underway. We move around, 100,000 students a day. So if you just look at the practical consequences, a couple of speakers discussed how the public school is in an area where there's high levels of asthma. Well, we have 21 depots. We have 5,000 buses. And you can understand, I'm sure people can understand, if you live next to a depot with 300 buses and in the morning they're all cranked up and they're pumping out the diesel, that's not a very good scenario, right? That's something we want to avoid. And obviously over the years, we're at a crisis point, right? We need to take action today. Also for my bus operators and my mechanics, breathing in that diesel is a carcinogen. And we were successful in one case to show the link between diesel exhaust and cancer. So there's a very practical side to it that we're trying to, all of us, right? It's time for change, frankly, right? We all understand that. What I'd like to discuss, there's a little bit of a rub, and it's a traditional rub between technology and your workforce. I guess from the Luddites up until today, right? When there's progress in technology, there's a loss of jobs. There's a loss of security. People work in coal mines knowing that it's dangerous and filthy work, but they also know that they can take care of their families. When we look at the electrification of buses, you're going to see less work. And of course, if you have less work, what that means for my members is, less work. Am I going to work? How am I going to take care of my family? And you get this tension, a traditional tension. And, when I asked one of my mechanics what percentage of work they'll lose by an electrification of bus, 25, 30% of my work. That's a big number. I have 1,000 maintainers. Now you're talking what? You need maybe 700. So I think we have to carefully think this through. And I don't depend on management, and I don't depend on the ruling class, if you want to call it that, to lead us out of this problem. They'll try to green the economy so they have a higher profit, frankly, even before they care about the consequences for their children or our children. So when I think about this, I think about, the just transition slogan. Usually people think about just transition when a factory is closing, a coal factory is closing, or a nuclear power plant. How do we just transition those workers to something else? And one of the things that I'm thinking about is we maybe have to change the whole idea of the work week. I mean, in a lot of places in the world today, they talk about a 4-day work week. And I think when you have less work, we shouldn't be thinking of having less workers. Thinking of having the workday lessened. One of the things from COVID is, and one of the things that's going around is there's a 4-day work week. I think we have to think of just transition, because if you tell workers there's going to be 30% less work and you don't give them something to look forward to, something for their children to look forward to. A lot of my workers, their family come from transit. it's a family type of thing, right?
Mm-hmm.
Of course, they took care of their family. Now their sons and daughters want to come to transit. So we have to kind of give something that's forward looking, that doesn't polarize, right, the conversation. And I think we have to look at issues like a just transition, also meaning we got to reduce the work week. So this way we could have more workers or the same amount of workers, right? Of course, when I say reduce the work week, the old slogan of 4 days work, 5 days pay, we wouldn't think of anything else. We ain't talking about 4 days work and 4 days pay. That's not what I'm talking about here. I'm talking about 4 days work and 5 days pay. And I think that's important because labor has to lead not only with its ability to negotiate contracts that reduce carbon emissions. I think that's very important. And working with communities where I have a bus depot in the community. Of course, I don't want the carbon emissions and the pollution and the sound and all the other things that come around an industrial work site to travel beyond the fences of the work and into the neighborhood. I don't want to see that either. But we also have to lead with some, hey, but there ain't going to be a loss of work. There won't be a loss of the security. Mm-hmm. You will have a good job and a good career, a union job and a union career, because too often green corporations talk about good jobs, but what are they talking about? $15 an hour? That's really not a good job unless it's for my son who's working part-time, So I look at this tension. I understand it's coming. We understand the federal government may be putting billions into, electrifying the roadways for all different types of vehicles. I just think labor has to make sure that we come out with demands that are dynamic, that meet the needs of their members, so that the members don't go home and say, we don't want that.
Right.
Because if we get that electric bus, I'm out of work. Mm-hmm. And we want to try to avoid that. So that's how I think we're trying to address it. That's how I know I'm trying to address this, because I know we have to do something. At the end of the day is we don't change the course of the economy. We're heading for disaster and there's no future at all. But we just have to do it in a way that we're bringing people in. And I think some a demand like that would help do that. So I hope that answered the question.
Yeah, it did. Thank you, JP. And what I really took away, I think, in part to what you just said, is that labor needs to lead. We need to be leading in this climate space, leading with our members, leading out front. And that's a perfect segue, actually, to our last panelist today, which is Gina Walsh. I want to say a big congratulations to Climate Jobs Illinois for their big win. I was really proud to help get it off the ground, and so proud to see it really take flight. And just last week, the governor signed this historic legislation in Illinois, which actually puts our state on a pathway to 100% clean energy, zero emission by 2045. And this was, I'm sure everyone has heard about this throughout the summit, this piece of legislation. It has a lot of components to it, but one of the things that is obviously most applicable to this panel is the establishment of a statewide initiative to run a carbon-free and healthy schools campaign and initiative in the state of Illinois. Climate Jobs Illinois, 15 different unions, both public sector. We have the IEA and the IFT, our teacher affiliates at the table, along with SEIU. But we also had a really strong contingent of building trades. And so that's why I want to bring Gina into the conversation here to talk about that win as from the perspective of the Insulators Union, which Gina was representing at our table, why they cared particularly about the Carbon-Free Schools Initiative, the role of the Climate Jobs Illinois table in getting this historic bill across the finish line. It's truly a great accomplishment, I think, for both labor and the climate action and activity. So Gina, can I turn it over to you to tell us more about what happened in Illinois and its connection to our Carbon-Free School Initiative?
Sure. Thanks, Nikki. And it's great to be on this panel with everybody. I really appreciate being included. And just to piggyback on what JP said and what President Bryant said, as union leaders, and as family members, as human beings, we know the value of a carbon-free society and how important these issues are, but we can't sell or bring our members along if there's nothing there from them, because it goes against all of our philosophies to go back. You can't take a guy that's wiring a building on Monday and just say, go put up solar panels next month. That's what you're going to do. And oh, by the way, we're going to be reducing your benefits and your pay by 50%. It doesn't work that way. We've all fought long and hard and stood on the shoulders of other people throughout the years to get our membership and our organizations to where they are. And it's important that we are a part of this conversation and that we continue to build on it. I did some work on the carbon-free schools part on climate jobs, because I think a lot of times you hear when you're building a building, you hear this term called value engineering. My craft is one of the last crafts in the building, but it's one of the most vital. When Seanelle is sitting in a classroom and she's got 6 kids with runny noses and, you know, she's got a pipe that's sweating in the back of the classroom, that's because their mechanical systems and the insulation systems on those mechanical systems aren't working properly, or they haven't been installed properly, or they're antiquated and haven't been maintained. That's a health issue. We knew this, our organization learned this about asbestos years ago, and we changed the name of our organization. And for 30 years, we've been removing asbestos from our buildings, and we're moving forward with that to continue to have clean buildings free of all these issues. And now it's the new time. We need to maintain these systems. And as we build new schools, and if we install proper systems and maintain them, they'll be fine. But we also have to retrofit the schools that we're adding on to as we move forward. And that's where the valued engineering comes in, because we're at the end of the food chain, right? When we go into a job, so wherever you can cut corners or cut costs on something, that might mean that you're not going to insulate the pipes coming off of this boiler, which, by the way, emits a great deal of greenhouse gases. For every foot of pipe you leave off, you lose 1 foot of pipe, you'll lose over $200 a year in cost savings. In a regular hospital, there's about 4 football fields worth of pipe in a hospital system. Many of your schools and universities have huge systems as well. The coalition in Illinois, we met regularly, and it was a great coalition because we had people from every aspect. It wasn't just the building trades, it was what was important to the teachers and what was important to the support staff in the buildings as far as carbon-free schools piece went, what was important to the people who maintain our nuclear plants, that we could just transition them. And we had some really good language for my craft in the carbon-free school piece. But I was very proud of the work that these folks did. It was interesting. I have been involved in this industry since 1979, and this was one of the first coalitions that I've been on ever that I wasn't probably the only woman in the room. So it was great to listen and hear from brothers and sisters about what was important to the students in their schools, to their families, and how we could move forward and help Illinois become carbon-free by 2050. We got a really good bill, and it was a negotiated bill. And at some point, it's very easy to read. I suggest y'all pull up the carbon-free school part on this 900-page bill and start on page 669, and you'll read about 4 pages. But that's the carbon-free school part of it, and it's really good. But each section is written really well. And you know, Nikki, how many years I have in the legislative process. It was interesting for me to be on the other end of it. I'm used to being a state representative or a senator and saying, I don't care, fix it. This is what I want. And when you're on the other side, it doesn't work that way. People like Joseph Bryant know that, and so do JP. They've dealt with their elected officials before. And when you're on the other end of it, you have to sit in rooms for long periods of time and work things out and send your negotiators in. And you get frustrated. Even myself, I said, well, why is that office being that way? Tell them this is how it's going to be. Well, that's not how it works. And, by that office telling us to go back to the table, we came out with a much better bill. It was so much better. And you do get frustrated, but there's some great things in this. And it's going to be a pathway and a map for other states across the country to move forward. I mean, there's a lot of progressive states. They've done a lot of good stuff in New York, in California, just to name a couple of them. In Illinois, they now have the strongest labor standards in the nation written into legislation that was passed last week and signed by the governor.
Yep.
So I'm very excited about it. I'm excited about the process. I learned a lot. They always say we keep learning, and it's true. And I learned a lot through that process. I'm really glad I got to be a part of this historical legislation. And I hope that kind of hit on what you wanted me to talk about, Nikki.
Yeah, you did. You did a great job, Gina. I would just, just echo the part about the negotiation. This was an 18-month process, I think, Gina, right? That took it had a lot of twists and turns, but the end product was really awesome for everyone. And like Gina said, the strongest labor standards in the country. As it relates to carbon-free schools, though, I want to lift up 3 things that I think the Climate Jobs Illinois Coalition did really good that's in legislation for everyone to consider in your own local and state jurisdictions. One is they were able to get in this legislation, right, Gina, a statewide energy audit, an energy audit that public schools can actually go through as a first step. Let's find out where the emissions are coming from in that particular public school. School districts can actually apply for funding to get that energy audit completed. There's funding in this bill for that as the first step in the campaign. I also just want to lift up, too, that, they had in this bill set aside renewable energy credits specifically for public schools, which I thought was also critically important. And then they prioritized to something Anil had mentioned earlier, Tier 1 and Tier 2 schools to be at the front of the line in our initiative in Illinois. So I just think, Gina, you guys did such a great job. Did I cut you off, though? Were you going to add something?
Well, I just wanted to, oftentimes there is a limit on which utilities pay, but in this bill, all schools will be covered.
Right.
Even if the utility, that particular utility does not cover a school in the area, they're all going to be able to take advantage of this, which is great. And for my part in it, we wanted to make sure, when you think of an energy audit, you think about the insulation in the walls and the envelope of the building. Well, that doesn't do any good if you're not taking care of the systems inside that are in that penthouse just below that roof, where everything's going up through the roof if they're not maintained. So we have specific language in the bill that requires the energy audit to do an audit of the mechanical insulation system and the maintenance of that system. So this is going to be a great thing for schools across Illinois. It's going to promote jobs, but every time we work on our schools, it promotes jobs. Our industry does nothing from June to as soon as they get their next quarter money till the school year starts. As Seanelle can probably tell you, she's seen people in hard hats in and out of her building all the time, right before school opens, and you feel like you're pushing to get it done, get the kids in. And we all want to get it done with legislation like this, and we want to get the kids in, but we want to get them in a healthy atmosphere so that they can learn and they can thrive in the safest place that should be for them in the world.
Thanks, Gina. That's great. That's really great. I'm going to ask just a closing question to our panel, and then I'm going to turn it over to my colleague, Dan Sherrill, who's going to, on Slido, facilitate some questions that we're getting from all of you in the audience. And we'd encourage you to participate through Slido and put your questions in now. But for our panelists, one more just general question. And maybe if you don't mind, President Bryant, I'll start with you. You know, the Carbon Free and Healthy Schools campaign, one of the great things about it is it does have an opportunity to engage membership and engage them in a campaign that is really the intersection between good jobs, which we fight for every day in the labor movement, and addressing the climate crisis. You know, how has SEIU Local 1021 used this campaign, and maybe it's through the collective bargaining process, to really engage members around climate action?
Sure. No, that's a great question, Nikki. And, you know, one, I would say you can't necessarily just start at the bargaining table. You have to build it up. I think, as others referenced, if you jump straight to that conversation about taking stances within climate justice, it might be a jump for membership to say, you know, how does this impact us? So that work has to be built from within. And one of the things that I think all of our locals have is a lot of members who are very conscious around this stuff, who are engaged in this stuff, and actually are the ones who are leading a lot of the work when it comes to, you know, creating the awareness around it. And then our part of what we do then is what you touched on, Nikki, is, you know, how do we think it through in a way, and Gina touched on it also, that is going to add jobs, that is going to add different skill sets so folks can get compensated more. And so really trying to connect both of those thoughts. One is to say, hey, we have a problem, we have to address it. You know, half of the West Coast is on fire, you know, at this point, and it's not a thing that's happening one-off. We are just dealing with it on season now. We assume that, you know, during the summer part, you know, we're going to be dealing with wildfires. So folks are feeling it in a different way. And then how, from that perspective, do we use the resources that are out there also? The monies that will be injected in the upcoming bills, the American Rescue Plan, all the different resources that are available should be thought through in a way that, you know, one, creates the consciousness about the problem, but then also goes back to what JP and Gina and others said, good jobs.
Yep. Thank you very much. Can I actually turn to Anil? Like, how did you in the Sunrise movement, like with students, obviously engage other fellow students around a carbon-free school initiative?
Yeah. So I think Sunrise's role here is obviously to like support the unions, and we obviously like recognize when we talk about like a Green New Deal and creating climate jobs, part of that is, you know, those have to be union jobs, right? Otherwise, you know, you can't just, otherwise good jobs is kind of just like empty if they're not, if that promise isn't backed up by like an actual union. And so our role is kind of to help build that coalition, like you said, to help bring in students into this conversation, because I mean, that's ultimately the only way we're gonna get change. Is the only way we've like really won significant change in this country is by building a broad coalition. I mean, we, like I said, with the climate strike, a lot of students are, you know, energized about it. A lot of students are, I think we were discussing this earlier, I think Daniel brought it up, that a lot of Gen Z doesn't see a point in like any career that's not something fighting climate change, which I think is like definitely true to some extent. So I think it's, I think people are, there's that like energy among young people. It's our job to like turn that into action, whether it's like supporting candidates for election who are gonna support initiatives like carbon-free and healthy schools, or like, you know, protesting them when they don't, and then working on like first getting those elected officials into office and then getting them to pass the bills. But yeah, so I think it comes down to like really just pointing young people in the right direction, and like channeling that energy into something that's like productive in this cause.
Thanks, Anil. Seanelle, can I ask you, like, I know you guys just kicked off your campaign in April. How are you engaging your students? How are you seeing other UFT members engaging around this initiative since you guys kicked it off?
Okay, so hello once again. We made it a part of our school-wide vision in order to have all members of the school community, all stakeholders buy in. We had to first, we created a committee where we would have leaders on each team, each grade team and department team to help bring about the initiative. We formed an eco team and made our students a part of that team so that students could then talk about the importance of caring for the environment, the importance of sustainability in education. And we also reached out to other schools within the community to find out what they were doing and also work with those schools in order to promote sustainability initiatives within the district. Because what we realized is that this doesn't work unless it's done systemically. It has to be across the board. Everyone has to be involved. And it definitely takes time and a lot of effort to bring about change because science is not always at the forefront despite what we're seeing happening in our environment. We see the negative impact, we see what it's doing to our communities, the cost to rebuild and to replace structures that are damaged and lives that could never be replaced. So we definitely have to work together to bring about changes. So those were some of the things that we did. We made it a part of our school vision, and we also incorporated other members of the community, including other schools, students, and parents as well.
That's great. Thank you, Seanelle. That's awesome. And Justin, could I just maybe ask you, how does the NEA see, you guys are very often the largest union in many states, lots of members to engage. Like, how are you seeing membership engagement around carbon-free schools?
Yeah, absolutely. One, thank you again. And also just a shout out to Gina and all of her work in Illinois. I know that our affiliate IEA has been involved in that, and I'm excited to continue to work with them and what we can do as this moves forward. I think in general, I just wanted to kind of talk about how, like, even in this polarized political climate that we're living in today, like, everyone agrees that our country's schools need to be safe and healthy for parents, educators, and communities. So this can really be something we can bring people together on. And like I think it was Anil said earlier, when we move to carbon-free schools and save on energy costs, like, we can repurpose that spending toward teaching and learning. And this transformation also just has the opportunity to galvanize that economy-wide transition to clean energy that we need to combat climate change. And I would be remiss to leave out the fact that communities of color and indigenous communities and under-resourced communities are constantly disproportionately impacted by these negative effects of climate change, and our students are really counting on us to deliver and establish this model for healthy and climate safe schools. The NEA has been consistently inspired by all the progress that's been made in cities and states across the country, especially with the help of the Climate Jobs National Resource Center. And we at the NEA, we want to continue working with our affiliates to support these campaigns. And like I think it was JP said earlier, labor should be leading on climate, and the NEA is certainly committed to being a part of that.
That's great, Justin. Thank you. JP, would you want to add anything from TWU's perspective, just how members are maybe engaged around electrification?
Well, at this stage, it's very early, and so we have some work to do. Obviously, there's a natural connection because transportation is obviously one of the areas where we're going to try to get people out of cars and onto trains and onto buses. So that part is understood. The role we play in the bigger picture, the electrification, we're in the beginning stages of that because now the city is moving aggressively to change the fleet. And I think as the contract comes up in about a year and a half, I think it's going to take on a much more, real conversation.
Mm-hmm.
So I think we're at the beginning stages of that. And I hope we're successful. And I'm going to be pushing my demands, one of them the 4-day work week for 5 days pay, because I think it's important. And I certainly do believe one of the things I learned in COVID, fighting COVID, is that bureaucracies and corporations can't lead. The unions have to lead. We're the ones that understand the needs of our members best, and they trust us. Unions, if you put a politician and a union representative side by side, my members are going to trust the union rep way before anybody else. So we have a role to play, and I just think it's important we play the right role, and that means finding that connection between, maintaining careers and good jobs and making sure we take on the biggest challenge of our life, which is not to die as the climate change happens and, all these other terrible things occur. So, hope that helps.
Realize the importance of this moment. And I think that's one of the things that Climate Jobs National Resource Center really wants to be, as we recognize that a lot of unions are first kind of getting into electric vehicles, or how to, best practices, what we learned from in Illinois could be applicable to something that New York might be starting, or vice versa. So Climate Jobs wants to be a resource in all of that work. So as we move forward, because this is too important work to leave it on the side. So with that, I'm going to wrap up and turn this over to my colleague, Dan Sherrill, who is our state to federal campaign director for Climate Jobs National Resource Center. We're really excited to have Dan join us. And he is going to, on Slido, facilitate the questions that we've received. Just to repeat for everyone, the Slido number is 464766, if that is helpful to you and you still need that. So Dan, can I hand this over to you?
Absolutely. Thank you so much, Nikki, and to all of the panelists for joining us today. This has felt like a really generative conversation to me, seeing all the folks from across the labor movement, different sectors of the economy, and beyond the climate movement in the classroom. And we've received a lot of great questions from the audience. We will not be able to address them all with the time that we have, but hopefully we can get to a few. And the first one is coming from one Adam Flint, who I believe I know from back in the day in the New York renewable energy space. He used to be with Southern Tier Solar Works, I think, when we last met. But he asked, well, first of all, he says, these panelists are amazing, but that's not a question. That's just something that was in the Slido. And then he asks, in New York, community-based organizations and unions working on the just transition in education and workforce institutions are largely siloed from each other. How can this be addressed? And so I wanted to direct that maybe to Seanelle and to JP, I know, who are doing some work in New York. How do we bridge that divide between community-based organizations and unions who often share some of the goals but don't always work side by side?
Either one first? How do you want to do it?
Go in, JP.
Okay. So I'm with Climate Jobs New York. And even though we're union-based, a lot of the things that we're trying to do is build coalitions with the school teachers and the community boards and the PTOs. And I think these third parties that have the interest of the working class communities and labor unions could play a key role, because they'll help introduce these different silos to each other. Sometimes I could tell you, as a union rep, I'm too busy in my world as a union rep to try to give that time and energy, to reaching outside. So I think third parties, positive, progressive forces are going to be necessary to bridge these different types of silos. So that's how I see it.
Great.
So in agreement with JP, I think with what we've been experiencing, we realize how interconnected we are, and that it is not a separate issue. So it's vitally important that we work together, even unions that would not normally work together. We realize the importance of coming together to bring across our message and actually bring about change within our school system and just our entire infrastructure, and the way in which we're going to deal with the effects of climate change and the creation of jobs that we can all benefit from while positively impacting the environment.
Thanks so much, Seanelle and JP. The next question I thought really for anyone on the panel, but especially for Joseph out in California. And we've got Steve Schallhorn from the Labor Education Center asking, school boards are major building operators and they need to reduce their greenhouse gas footprint. Can unions and school boards work cooperatively to reduce school emissions?
Sure, I can jump in, Dan. Thanks for the question, Steve. Yes, and I think taking a step back from that, it means that we have to elect education board members who prioritize this prior to getting in office. Usually helps. So I think in the process of working with school boards, it should be one of the things on minds of labor organizations as a priority in those conversations prior to endorsement, and then holding folks accountable once they are in those positions, if they have made certain commitments. And then the school board members who are not getting it or do not prioritize it or deny it, those are the ones that need to be removed. So I think our approach has to be vigilant in the area of elected leaders need to have the best interest of kids and the communities in mind constantly. And if they do not meet those standards, then we should find others who do meet those standards.
Amazing. Couldn't agree more, Joseph. Thank you. And then we have a question from Sarah Ross, who's with Undaunted K-12. She actually has two questions. The first is really for anyone on the panel, but maybe in particular for you, Nikki, who just finished up a stint in the White House. She asks, how could a climate ambitious federal Department of Education support carbon-free and healthy schools? So.
I can jump in, and then maybe Justin might have, from the NEA perspective, have something to add. I mean, I think a lot of this is education. I think the Department of Education could be a resource to states and locals that are interested in taking on this initiative. Again, an opportunity to share best practices. And honestly, it's also about funding. I mean, one of the great things that I think the Climate Jobs Illinois Coalition was able to do was, again, secure funding for a statewide audit of public schools. School districts are really strapped for resources. They need funding in order to prioritize initiatives like a carbon-free and healthy school initiative. So DOE could provide resources to help with that energy audit if a state is unable to do that. But I also think it's about, the renewable energy credits, for example, in Illinois, setting those aside, specifically trying to work to earmark the public buildings, get priority first in renewable energy subsidies, because that's obviously for the common good. Those are community buildings, and it's something that I think it'd be easier on the government side, both at the federal and the state level, for funding to be set aside for. So I think DOE could be a partner in the states, to the states in these initiatives. But Justin might have, additional comment as well at the federal level.
Thanks, Nikki. Yeah, I mean, I think your answer was really covered kind of the gist of what I would have talked about too. I think on a more broad scale, I think that we all know that the education sector in general is often forgotten about when it comes to issues around climate change. And actually, our president, Becky Pringle, over the past year, sat on the K-12 Climate Action Commission headed by the Aspen Institute that was co-chaired by former Secretary of Education John King. And that group was really trying to harness the power of education to develop climate solutions. Miguel Cardona was involved a little bit in that, and they actually just released their action plan today. So we've got that out there, but it's just making sure that trying to make sure that the Department of Education knows that, like, if we're going to have discussions about climate, education needs a seat at the table, because our students are the ones that are suffering.
Yeah, So important. Thank you, Justin and Nikki. Sarah from Undaunted K-12 also had another question. Is there polling of union members on support for carbon-free and healthy schools? So folks can talk about numerical polling or just conversations you're having with your rank and file members. Where do you think folks are at on this issue? Might pass that to Gina since she hasn't had a question.
I was just unmuting myself, Daniel. I am not aware of any polling within our organization. I know we are having conversations. This is going to be a great transition for my industry. I earned most of my living from 1979 till about 2012 in oil refineries. And we all know in 20 years, oil refineries as we know them will no longer exist, or coal burning power plants. So we are watching as they close and trying to transition our workforce into a cleaner workforce. And just since I retired from the tools in 2012, for example, I've talked to some of the apprentices and some of the new products they're working with. I've never seen them. So it's a fast transitioning industry. My daughter is a pipe insulator and she'll come home and say, oh, I'm working with this. And I'm like, what is that? Well, it's a new thing we're using. It's safer. It's this or it's that. So we're working hard, and so is the industry to keep up, because this is fast. This is happening really fast. To think that I was working in a coal burner not 10 years ago in Southern Illinois that no longer exists. 2 of them within 20 miles of each other. And I can remember standing on the deck of a nuclear plant in Illinois at its highest point and looking out and seeing 3 other plants. You don't do that anymore. And we're preparing our workforce to transition into doing the same job in a different way. And I think the other crafts are doing it as well. I have never seen any polling.
Yeah. Thanks, Gina. And that transition from you to your daughter, I mean, I think that's what we're trying to build writ large here, right? We want to build not only part-time lousy contract gigs, but we want to build the opportunity for multi-generational careers building out the clean energy economy. And I really think that could see us through the 21st century, but not unless we've got labor in the driver's seat and not unless we're building the clean energy economy at the scale that science demands. So I love that. I had a question from Ben Fuchs, who's out in California. He's a lawyer with, I believe, SEIU 10 to 1. And he asked a very basic campaigning question that I can pose to anybody, but maybe Gina, you'd again be the most qualified here since Illinois has such a robust campaign on this. He asks, for those of you on the East Coast, I'll include the Midwest here, who have been working on rolling this campaign out already, anything you wish you'd done differently?
Well, I can speak to that. I bet Nikki could speak to it as well. Nikki came to me at least 2 years ago and asked me to get on board when I was president of the Missouri Building Trades. And my organization at the time, the State Building Trades, chose not to participate, right? They didn't right away see the value in it. And I think that they're having second thoughts now because their neighbor, Illinois, has this great piece of legislation. But it takes a while to roll it out. There's a lot of things, messaging. It's a learning process, and each time you do it in a different state, I think you've had some success in New York. I'm sure we've learned lessons from the way they did it. There was, didn't Connecticut, Nikki, if I'm correct, just pass a bill as well through climate jobs? And I would like to see us as a coalition or the National Climate Jobs make a list of lessons learned and kind of like a roadmap of where we went right when we should have gone left or things that we did. But you have to keep in mind that every state's political system is different. And that feeds into it a lot. It depends, JP, on who's driving the bus is pretty much who it depends on and in what states. And when you have 50 different states you're dealing with, you're going to have 50 different climate job coalitions, and all of them are going to be just have little bitty nuances that are going to be different. But I would like to see some kind of document that's a basic document of what we could have done better. Mm-hmm. So that's my answer. I hope that answers it for you, Daniel, and I'll turn it over to Nikki Budzinski.
I guess if I could just add one thing, I think Gina covered it, but one thing I think that Climate Jobs did really well, but needs to continue to build on, is a campaign mobilization person for all of the states that are building climate jobs coalitions. It's really important that you have someone dedicated to mobilizing members both inside the coalition, and then with the Carbon-Free Schools Initiative in Illinois, I know that coalition was able to engage the School Administrators Association. So we actually, in that case, we were able to engage on the management side and have them be a part of the table for carbon-free and healthy schools. And that just added even more political heft and importance to the campaign when I think they were trying to get that through the legislature. So I think getting outside stakeholders outside of labor is important, engaging folks like the Sunrise Movement and others that are like-minded, but then also having dedicated resources and a person for mobilization. Gina, did I miss something?
You didn't miss anything, but once the bill is passed, the most important part is going to be the implementation of it.
Yeah.
And making sure that the coalition is involved in the implementation of it and how it rolls out. That's going to be vital. You can do all that work, but if you're not at the table when it's being implemented, things can change, and they can change rapidly. So that's an important part of it.
Totally. And I've got folks jostling in the question queue. Where can I get a link to this Illinois legislation? This is actually from John Forster, who I also know from back in the day, local DC 37. Hi, John. You can just go to climatejobsillinois.org, and it is a banner at the top of the website, a link to the legislation they just passed. And I just want to note that legislation includes amazing schools provisions, but also goes way beyond schools to track the entire path of decarbonization and fair labor job creation in the state of Illinois through 2045, I believe, right, Gina? Yeah, 2045.
It is through 2045. It's 2408 is the Senate bill. Yeah, it's a 900-page bill. But Climate Jobs does a really good job of giving you a roadmap through their website of what to look for and where to look for it at.
Great. Thanks so much, Gina. And that's another lesson for us, right? Like, what are we going to do differently going forward? I mean, the idea here is this gets easier and easier to talk to union members about and to talk to community-based organizations about, because when people ask, what's in this for us? Why should we be devoting time for it? Pointing to that giant victory in Illinois, not all state political systems are the same by any means, as Gina points out, but we're starting to really see the fruits of this campaign in a pretty tangible way. And I think we can point to that across our state boundaries when we're trying to get this stuff started. The last question before we transition back to Nikki, maybe 1 or 2 minutes, Anil, I'd love to ask your thoughts. Just zooming out a little bit, why start with schools? We're going to need to decarbonize the entire building sector by mid-century to meet the goals demanded by science and the Biden administration. So why do you feel that schools in particular are a good tip of the spear for doing that transition?
Yeah, I mean, oh, sorry, that was from you, right?
Yeah.
Okay. Yeah, I mean, I think there's a couple of reasons. First of all, it makes sense to start with public assets, right? Like, it's a lot easier for the government to do it to its own property than like to either incentivize or mandate the private sector. Of course, the private sector has to play a component here. And we see that with like electrification of the vehicle fleets, like JP was saying, electrification of buses. By the way, my dad also works for FTA bus company. And he does a lot of work with like EPA and OSHA compliance. So he's always talking about like diesel and asbestos and all those effects on workers. So like it's like music to my ears. But I digress. So it makes sense to start with public assets. And then it also makes sense to do buildings because I'm not sure exactly the national statistics, but I know in New York City, It's about 2/3 of our emissions come from buildings. So you got to tackle them. So public buildings, of those public buildings, schools are a great place to start because you can tackle the issue of climate change, but also like 6 or 7 other issues. And we kind of touched on a lot of them during the discussion, but you can improve education, not only improving kids' focus, but also providing opportunities for what they call like career and technical education in the New York City school system. So like preparing our kids for like the trades of the future. So like what better way than actually having them see it in their own schools. You're also improving our like social and economic disparities. In New York City, I think it's around like 75% of public school students are considered economically disadvantaged, huge percentage of Black and other students of color. So you're not only tackling climate change, but also tackling equity and climate justice. And yeah, all in all, like because you're tackling all of these different issues, public schools are a great place to start with making them carbon free.
Amazing. Thanks so much, Anil. And to everyone, we have about 3 minutes left here, so I will pass it back to Nikki to wrap us up.
Okay, thanks a lot, Dan. Just a big thank you to all of our panelists. It's so wonderful to have panelists from Northern California to New York City, to Queens, and then to my home state of Illinois participating. But just to say that this is a campaign that is really taking off with Climate Jobs National Resource Center. We're building on all of the work that you all are doing in states like Connecticut and Rhode Island. And so we're really excited about this. I think this campaign has always been something very special to me because it truly is the intersection of membership engagement, addressing big issues like climate change, and then creating good union jobs, which is, I know, what all of us are here and about. So I just want to say a big thank you again to everyone on the panel. Please use the National Climate Jobs National Resource Center as a resource to you if you are in a state that hasn't started an initiative but is interested in doing so. I know that both Dan and I would love to be a resource to you. And we can connect you with these fine folks on this call who have been leading the way on this really exciting campaign. So a big thank you to everyone. And I think we're about to be joined by Secretary Marty Walsh in the larger summit room. So thanks again.
Thank you. Have a good day.
Thank you.